Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday afternoon, September 7th, and this will be the Week 4 message for Political Science 1013, Fall 2025 on the first 8-week schedule. Everyone, we're going to have two discussions this week. We need to get two discussions in before the midterm exam. The midterm is coming up not this week, but next week. 1 week from this Tuesday the 16th. It will cover Units 3 and 4, plus 4 articles we've asked you to access online. And everyone, please contact me if you're having trouble accessing those articles. We now have full access to the New York Times through the library, and I tried to send out instructions on how to do that. I've given you 4 things from the New York Times for the midterm exam. We'll do discussion 2 Monday and Tuesday, the 8th and 9th. It may be Monday the 8th before you see this announcement, so the discussion will be underway. The discussion has to do with the media. We discussed in the class notes on the media the significance of satirical media, including on part of the late night talk show hosts. Of course, some people think that is a kind of a declining business. Stephen Colbert now has had his show canceled effective next year. But we're looking at the South Park episode that recently appeared just a few weeks ago that amounted to a send-up of President Trump. And of course, as with just about everything on South Park, it was quite bawdy and maybe even vulgar, and that's perhaps some people's cup of tea and not others. It's worth wondering, can we really say that we're living under some kind of authoritarian or autocratic regime when people can put something like that up on TV and get away with it? At the same time, someone might argue that such a thing doesn't really pose a problem for Trump, although his spokesperson was quite vehement in denouncing the show. So we wondered what you thought of that, and we'll try to discuss that and kick it around in our second discussion that will take place this Monday and Tuesday, the 8th and 9th. Remember, you need to post at least twice over the 48 hours for full credit. And then everyone, once that is over, look for another announcement right away about discussion 3, which will take place later in the week before we do the midterm exam early next week on Tuesday the 16th. Okay, so look for 2 discussions before the midterm exam. So we did Unit 3, we discussed those class notes on Unit 3, Mass Media, last week. We got started on the Constitution. We got through the Constitutional Convention. I want to take just a little while to finish up Unit 3 today before we finish this up. Remember, everybody, you have a quite lengthy reading assignment for Unit 3. There's a total of 4 chapters from the textbook. I hope you will look especially closely at Chapter 2 and then look at 3, 4, and 5 as time permits. Traditionally, in a course like this, we emphasize the Federalist Papers. They are included, 2 of them, in the appendix to your textbook, Federalist Papers numbers 10 and 51, written by James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Quite important documents in American history. I try to go through the high points of them in the class notes, but it's kind of an important part of your education to take a look at those as closely as you can. It's 18th century language, so you may need to set a little bit of time aside, but what we have here are essays that argue for the adoption of the Constitution and give us an account of why the Constitution is the way it is and why certain provisions were placed in the Constitution. So that's important for us to look at. Everyone, we don't go through every detail of the Constitution. We try to go through it in as thorough a detail as we can. We don't touch on every amendment. We do look at in some detail at the first 7 articles and some of the more important constitutional amendments. Articles 1 through 7, Articles 1, 2, and 3 lay out the branches of government. Congress comes first in Article 1, and that's sort of what some people think is that reflects the founders' view that Congress really was primary. Article 2 discusses the presidency and executive branch. Article 3, the judiciary. We spend quite a bit of time on Article 1, because it lays out the powers of Congress, which by and large are the powers of the United States government. So there's provisions there with regard to the powers of Congress and also limitations on those powers, which are worth taking a look at. And so of those first three articles, we spend the most time on Article 1. So Articles 1, 2, and 3 establish the branches of government. Article 4 gives us the so-called comity clauses. Pardon me, everybody. The clauses that lay down the terms for relations among the states and between the states and the federal government. The full faith and credit and privileges and immunities clauses. Article 5 lays out the amendment procedure. Okay. And with some exceptions, with only one exception, the procedure that's usually used is that Congress, through a vote of supermajority in both chambers, proposes the amendment, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures must approve it. Okay, there was one exception made to that for the repeal of prohibition that you will read about, I believe, in the class notes. And there's also provision for calling a constitutional convention, although we haven't had one since the original one, all those nearly 250 years ago. Okay. Article 6 gives us the so-called supremacy clause, which some people think gives us the authority for the Supreme Court to exercise the power of judicial review. Article 7 lays out the procedure for ratification. Okay, and it was stipulated at the time in Article 7 that the Constitution would take effect upon ratification in 9 states, even though the Articles of Confederation had said that unanimous agreement of all the states would be required for any changes. But they stipulated that it would go into effect with the ratification of 9 states, and everyone ended up honoring that. Okay. We then discussed the Federalist Papers. We look at how the Federalist Papers came about, largely on part of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. The two you will be reading will be by Madison, numbers 10 and 51. We try to talk a little bit about the theory of constitutionalism that's laid out there. It's really borrowed from English constitutionalism and even ancient Greek ideas about government going way, way back before that. But we try to draw some parallels between Greek, English, and American ideas about constitutionalism. And what you will see is often said that we have a relatively young government that incorporates some fairly ancient ideas, such as the system of separation of checks and balances that are laid out in the early articles, and there are checks that may be exercised by each of the 3 branches on the others. And we try to lay out some of the most important ones there in that part of the class notes. Now, the Bill of Rights, everybody, were of course demanded by the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, and the Federalists, men like Madison and Hamilton, didn't really think they were necessary, but agreed to tack them on anyway, and they were added shortly after the original 7 articles were ratified and went into effect. Okay. Amendment 1 is very, very important. It lays out protections for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Congress is to make no law impairing or limiting any of those. There are 2 clauses about religion that sometimes are understood as working at cross purposes: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Now, one thing that's going on is that the Supreme Court, under the influence of the justices that Trump has appointed, is moving toward a more accommodationist view of church and state, rather than the strict wall of separation or separation of church and state that you may have heard about. Some of Trump's supporters want that wall of separation to be a little less absolute. That's something that's going to continue to go before the Supreme Court, which has made a series of religion-friendly decisions lately. And so that's worth thinking about and keeping in mind. The Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms, which of course is something of a political hot potato. The Fourth Amendment gives us our protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. It doesn't say that there are absolutely no searches without seizures, but there are certain requirements that must be met if a search warrant is to be issued. Also important, the Eighth Amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, which has come up with regard to capital punishment, which the Supreme Court at one point appeared to have declared unconstitutional. But a couple of years later, they reconsidered the issue and agreed to permit capital punishment with certain restrictions and regulations placed upon it. So that's an important constitutional issue there. The Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, are an important set of amendments, especially the 14th. Some people say that the 14th Amendment, in effect, gives us an entirely new constitution because it changes the relationship between the states and the feds and puts the feds in a little stronger position and the states in not quite so strong a position. You might say the provisions of the 14th Amendment potentially give you a cause of action against your state governments if they violate equal protection of the laws or due process of law or the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. Okay? And so it was only because those provisions were added that the Supreme Court eventually was able to declare in the 1950s segregation of public schools to be unconstitutional. Without the 14th Amendment, that decision would not have been possible. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 15th Amendment stated that the right to vote was not to be abridged because of race or previous condition of servitude. Okay. There is a provision in the 14th Amendment that at one point was thought to be applicable, or arguably, it was argued, could be applicable against President Trump if he tried to run for president again, because it stated that no one would be eligible for public office if they engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the government of the United States. That was meant to apply primarily to officers of the Confederate government and the Confederate Army, but arguably it was applicable to the events of January 6, 2021. A case to that effect went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that only Congress could act to enforce that provision against a candidate for public office in present times. Now, the 25th Amendment is another one that I discuss in some detail. It was speculated at one point that the 25th Amendment might have been invoked against President Trump at the very end of his term, his first term. Now, the 25th Amendment is often regarded as kind of constitutionally awkward and perhaps something that sets us up for future constitutional problems. It came about after the assassination of President Kennedy, who, as it so happened, died pretty quickly after having been shot, but it was speculated he might, under someone like that, under certain circumstances, might have lingered as an invalid. And so in a situation like that, it would be a good idea to allow for the vice president to be made acting president. Okay? And so it was suggested that Vice President Mike Pence might have invoked those provisions against Donald Trump at the very end of his first term to prevent him doing something quite extreme. Eventually, he did leave office under protest, continuing to claim that the election had been stolen. But to invoke that provision, you would have to stipulate that the president was disabled and unable to exercise the duties of office, and Donald Trump more likely would never have admitted that. Okay. It is regarded as a kind of perhaps hastily composed and constitutionally awkward provision of the Constitution, so it's worth looking at what we have to say about the 25th Amendment. After that, everybody, we discuss briefly civil rights, civil liberties, and issues of federalism, each of which are treated in one chapter in your textbook. So we hope you will look at the class notes and look at those chapters from the text as time permits. Look at them perhaps a little more quickly, read them through than you would Chapter 2, which is about the Constitution as a whole. Be sure you understand the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Okay. Civil rights, primarily, the way we use the term, have been held to apply to race relations and the right not to be discriminated against. Well, that's not the only example of civil rights. There have been some highly contentious issues lately with regard to civil liberties, especially freedom of speech. And we try to discuss some of those in the class notes. So be sure you understand the difference between civil rights and civil liberties and some of the ongoing issues concerning each. Federalism concerns the relation between different levels of government. And the United States is considered a good example of a federal system. We give constitutional status to both the federal government and the states. But the language in the Constitution is ambiguous, and so there can be quite a tug-of-war, push and pull at times over exactly where the power of the feds leaves off and the power of the states picks up. The federal system was changed significantly with the administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt back in the 30s and 40s with his New Deal programs. They put the feds in a stronger position and the states in not quite so strong a position, largely because of money that was given, what we call grants in aid, from the feds to the states, but with strings attached. So you don't get the money unless you abide by the regulations and restrictions that constitute the strings attached. And we try to go through several different areas of policy. K through 12 education, higher education, highways, welfare, healthcare, and exactly what the relationship between the feds and the states is and how it might have changed in recent times. You might have heard that President Trump is trying to invoke those strings attached to money given for research to some of the biggest, most prestigious institutions of higher education in the country, to try to strike back at them and punish them for what he felt were inadequate protection against anti-Semitism on campus. That's been an ongoing system and maybe the latest development in the relationship between the states and the feds with regard to higher education. That's an ongoing dispute that you no doubt have heard about and which I believe we discuss to some extent in the class notes. All right, everybody, that will be it for this week. Next week, we will try to discuss for a few minutes those articles that we've assigned for you for the midterm exam, which will be coming up on Tuesday the 16th. Well, that's early in the week, and so we will try to go on next week to talk about Unit 5 on the presidency, which is the beginning of the material for Exam 3. So take it easy, study hard. I hope you will take part in both discussions this week. And next weekend, we will be getting ready for the midterm exam. We'll talk about that a bit more when we talk to you about a week from now. Take it easy, study hard. We'll see you in about a week's time.